In 1931, they sealed it shut, poured concrete down the main shaft, welded the access hatch, filed the closure paperwork with the county clerk, and walked away. The official record calls it exactly what it was on paper: an exhausted silver mine, tapped out, unprofitable, not worth the cost of keeping the pumps running through another winter. For 90 years, that was the whole story. Then last spring, a survey crew showed up. They were trenching fiber optic cable for a rural broadband expansion, the kind of unglamorous infrastructure work that happens in forgotten corners of the country every single day. Their job was to run line along an old access road that hadn't seen a vehicle in decades. Routine, boring, right up until their ground-penetrating radar lit up with something that had no business being there. A cable, already buried, running parallel to the road, then turning, then heading straight for the base of the mountain. At first they assumed it was old mining junk, an abandoned power line, maybe telegraph wire, the sort of thing you find rusting around any industrial site from 100 years ago, so they dug it up to reroute around it. And that is when the story stopped making sense. The cable was modern, fiber optic, wrapped in shielding that didn't exist in 1931, didn't exist in 1980, barely existed 15 years ago, and it was live, carrying a signal, pulsing with data, moving in and out of a mine that has been sealed, on paper, since before most of your grandparents were born. Someone ran a high-speed connection into a hole in the ground that officially contains nothing but rock and standing water. And they did it recently, so let me tell you what we actually know. And then let me tell you why the people who should have answers keep quietly changing the subject. The mine itself has a paper trail, and at first glance it looks completely ordinary. Opened in the 1880s during a regional silver rush, changed hands a few times, produced modest ore for about 40 years, then declined the way these operations always did. The 1931 closure was written up as a simple economic decision. Costs went up, the vein ran thin, the company folded the site into a holding entity and shut it down. But when researchers went looking for the production records, they found gaps. Big ones. For a mine that was supposedly barely profitable, the amount of money that moved through it in the 1920s was strange. Payroll for hundreds of workers. Shipments of equipment that had nothing to do with silver extraction. Cast iron, copper conductors, precision castings, and enormous quantities of a fine white powder listed on the manifests only as processing material. None of it matches the story of a small, dying silver operation. And here is the detail that keeps people up at night. The closure in 1931 wasn't gradual. It was sudden. 1 month there are hundreds of men on the payroll and active supply orders. The next month, nothing. The site is sealed, the workforce is dispersed, and the local newspaper, which covered every church picnic and cattle sale for 50 miles, runs exactly one sentence about it. A mine that employed a huge share of the county closed almost overnight, and the town's own paper barely mentioned it. That is not how communities behave when a major employer shuts down. That is how they behave when they are told not to talk about it. Descendants of some of those workers still live in the area, and a few of them have talked. The stories that survived in those families are all variations of the same thing. Grandfathers who worked the site for years and would never describe what they actually did there. Men who came home with good pay and a firm warning to keep their mouths shut. One family passed down a single line from a grandfather who worked the final shift before the seal went on. He said that at the end, they were not digging anything out of the mountain. They were putting something in. Now, this is where the mainstream explanation and the other explanations split apart. So let's take the mainstream one seriously first, because it deserves that. The official read is simple. The mine closed for ordinary reasons during the early years of the Great Depression, when thousands of marginal operations across the country went under. The odd manifests can be explained by diversified industrial activity. The sudden closure reflects a company running out of cash. And the modern cable? Almost certainly a mistake in the survey data, or an unrelated line installed by a utility that lost track of its own records. Boring answers. Probably true, except the cable is not a data error. It was physically dug up, photographed, and traced. It has a beginning and an end, and the end goes into the mountain. That is the fact that will not go away no matter how you explain the rest. So people started asking a different kind of question. Not what was mined here, but what was built here, and what still needs power and a connection to keep running. This is where the revisionist crowd comes in, and I want to be careful, because some of what gets said online about places like this is nonsense, but not all of it. And the part that isn't nonsense is genuinely hard to dismiss. The argument goes like this. What if the standard economic history of the early 20th century is missing entire industries? Not because they failed, but because they were deliberately written out. We are taught a clean story. Coal, then oil, then electricity, distributed on the grid we still use today. A tidy progression. But scattered across the record are references to older infrastructure that doesn't fit. Buildings wired for electricity decades before the official grid reached them, municipal systems that were quietly dismantled, power generation methods that appear in patents and newspaper ads, then simply vanish from the story. The people who study this call it a suppressed industrial baseline. The claim is that an earlier, more decentralized energy and communication network existed, was more advanced than we're told, and was slowly replaced by a centralized system that was easier to meter, easier to own, and easier to bill. The old network wasn't destroyed all at once. It was starved, sealed, and forgotten, one site at a time. And a sealed mine, they argue, is the perfect place to hide a piece of that network. Deep, temperature stable, shielded by millions of tons of rock off every map that matters. If you wanted something to keep operating quietly for a century, you could do a lot worse than a shaft everyone was told was empty. And this mine, they point out, is not the only one. Across the country and across Europe, there are sealed shafts, capped wells, and walled-off tunnels that carry the same fingerprints. Sudden closures clustered in the same narrow band of years. Production numbers that never quite added up. Workforces that vanished and stayed quiet. Ownership that dissolves into paper the second you pull on the thread. Taken one at a time, each is just an old mine with a messy file. Lined up next to each other, they start to look less like coincidence and more like a decommissioning campaign that somebody ran on purpose, site by site, until the old map was wiped clean. Now, normally, this is where I'd tell you it's just a theory. Interesting, unprovable, filed under things we'll never really know. But then there's the cable. Because a theory doesn't need fiber optic. A theory doesn't pulse with live data. Whatever is down there, if anything is down there, someone in the present tense is spending real money to talk to it. A few technically minded people got hold of the readings the survey crew captured before they were told to stand down. The traffic on that line was not random noise, and it was not a stray utility signal. It was structured, steady. Bidirectional, meaning data was moving in both directions, into the mountain and back out again. Whatever sits at the far end is not a passive sensor quietly logging the temperature. It is answering. Something down there receives, processes, and replies. The volume was low but constant, the kind of patient, unhurried exchange you would expect from a machine that has been running for a very long time and has nowhere it needs to be. So a small group of researchers tried to do the obvious thing. They tried to find out who owns the mine now, and who is paying for that connection. The ownership trail is a maze. The original mining company was folded into a holding firm in 1931. That firm was absorbed by another, which was restructured, which was bought out, which eventually dissolved into a shell entity with a registered address that turns out to be a mail forwarding service in another state. Every time someone gets close to a name, the name belongs to a company that belongs to another company that no longer files anything. The fiber connection is worse. Utility companies in the region have no record of authorizing it. The land is technically private, held by that same dissolved chain of entities. Nobody is willing to say who buried a modern cable across private land and ran it into a federally sealed mine, which, by the way, is illegal several different ways. And when a couple of the researchers filed formal requests for the old closure and safety records, the requests came back partially fulfilled, with the most interesting years redacted. Redacted, on a supposedly worthless silver mine that has been closed since 1931. You do not redact the file on nothing. At least one person tried to get inside. An urban explorer with a modest following documented his plan to reach the mine and then went dark before he ever posted the footage. His channel simply stopped. People who knew him say he made it to the site, found the old entrance right where the map said it would be, and found something bolted over it that was far newer than the seal from 1931. Fresh steel, a modern industrial lock, on the door of a mine that no living company will admit to owning. He never published whatever he saw, if he saw anything at all, and to this day he will not talk about the trip. Here is where I have to be honest with you about the limits of what we know, because the responsible thing is to draw the line clearly. We do not know what is inside the mine. Nobody has been down there, at least not officially, and the entrance remains sealed. We cannot confirm the manifests point to anything more exotic than ordinary industry. The cable is real and documented, but its destination inside the mountain has not been physically confirmed by anyone willing to go on record. Everything past the sealed door is inference. But inference is not the same as fantasy. And the pattern here is the thing that unsettles people who came in as skeptics. A mine that made too much money to be what it claimed. A closure too sudden to be ordinary. A workforce that scattered and stayed silent. A paper trail engineered to dead end. Records redacted 90 years later. And a live, modern, expensive connection running into a place that is supposed to be empty and forgotten. Any one of those things has a boring explanation. All of them together, in the same place, is what makes this hard to walk away from. The revisionist reading ties it into a bigger claim, and this is the part you can take or leave. That the economic history we are taught is not just incomplete, but shaped. That the transition from an older, stranger, more distributed industrial world to the centralized one we live in now was not a natural evolution, but a managed one. That the winners of that transition had every reason to seal the losers underground and rewrite the ledger, and that a handful of those old sites were never actually decommissioned. They were just hidden well enough that the only clue left is a wire nobody was supposed to find. And if that reading is even partly right, the implications reach a lot further than one mountain in the middle of nowhere. It would mean the story of how we built the modern world, that clean and confident line from coal to oil to the grid, has holes cut into it on purpose. It would mean there were roads not taken that were not abandoned by accident, but closed by decision, because someone concluded that a distributed system nobody could fully own and fully bill was a problem worth burying. In that version of events, the mine is not a mystery at all. It is a receipt. Whether you buy that or not, the specific facts of this specific mountain remain unexplained. The cable is still there. The signal is still moving. The records are still sealed. And the entities that could answer a single one of these questions continue to not exist in any way you can serve a subpoena on. The survey crew that found the cable was told, eventually, to reroute their broadband line around the site and leave the buried cable undisturbed. The instruction did not come from the local government. It came from a legal firm representing an owner that, on paper, dissolved decades ago. Think about what that means. A company that officially does not exist reached out, in the present day, with lawyers and authority, to protect a connection running into a mine that officially contains nothing. Ghosts do not hire attorneys. Somebody is home, and so we are left with the same question we started with, only heavier now. Not why is there internet running into a sealed mine. We know that much. Something down there needs it. The real question is what has been running, quietly, in the dark, under a mountain everyone was told was empty, for the last 90 years. And who has been listening to it this whole time? We may never get to open that door. Sealed, it turns out, does not always mean empty. But now you know it's there. And you know that somewhere, right now, data is flowing down into the mountain. And something is flowing back. What do you think is